从高速增长逐步的转换到中高速增长。
China's first quarter growth rate has reached 6.9%, and it's projected that at the end of the second quarter, the growth rate will be about 6.8%. What is driving current growth, and what can we expect for the second half of the year? China's consumer price index has risen 1.5% this year, and the producer price index has risen 5.5%. The CPI is within government estimates, but some still fear signs of subdued consumer demand could trigger deflation. What can we learn from these statistics, and what can government do to manage the appropriate balance? While US President Donald Trump continued pushing for his controversial policies during the G20 summit in Germany, Chinese President Xi Jinping reaffirms a commitment to multilateralism. How is China's role shaping up in the world economy? And what does multilateralism mean to China's economy? In April, China's 5 major banks announced their quarterly earnings. Although their profit margins are in decline, their bad debt situation has improved. What are the main factors bringing the bad debt under control? And what further measures should be implemented?
Welcome to our studio discussion here, gentlemen. China's CPI grew 1.5 year on year and CPI 5.5. Sorry, it's the other way around. PPI 5.5% in June. How do you relate the figure to the momentum of China's economic growth?
Well, I think the important thing to note here is that obviously the government is hoping for a bit higher consumer inflation. It's a little bit low. PPI is about where it's expected, but I think the key point here is that there were no surprises. These two numbers were exactly, I think, what the investment community was predicting would come in at. So I think that while consumer inflation is a bit on the low side, that this is a good signal that things are going as planned.
What do you think of this danger of deflation?
Well, I noticed there is the structural gap where the consumer's price remains on the low side, and theoretically it should be at par with the PPI, the producers or ex-factory prices, but there is also a time lag to translate the purchase price into the consumer price. But that's also indicative of two phenomena. Number one is that consumers are lack of buying passion. The other is that they are shifting more onto the service sector. So therefore, when the PPI is more inclusive or is more implicative of the more of the real industry production. So good news and bad news.
Premier Li Keqiang said at the recently concluded working conference at the State Council that domestic spending has been able to contribute up to 77% to the GDP growth. What do you make of this impressive growth?
Well, I think, again, it shows that the Chinese system does work in that, one, it flips the Western methodology on its head, where Western governments, the Western analyst community says, run your economy and let the numbers fall where they may, whereas the Chinese government takes perhaps a more corporatist approach in that they manage their earnings, manage the GDP growth rate towards a certain target. And I think it shows that it's working. The government is able to operate the economy more or less the way it wants to. And I think the key point to note here is Premier Li Keqiang also said the biggest threat, while deflation I think is a concern that the global investment community is paying close attention to, but the biggest risk to China and also the world is no development.
Well, given the robust growth in domestic spending, we are wondering aloud why there are complaints about the poor income distribution. Because the purchasing power enables consumers to spend more, but if disposable income distribution has become a problem, then how do you explain the robust momentum of the domestic spending?
Well, at the moment, if you look at the broad figure, the personal disposable income on the average is almost at the par as the GDP growth, but you also notice a high disparity between the coastal area and the hinterland area, and also between the big cities versus the third-tier cities. So there's a disparity over there, and also within those cities, you see that the middle-income class is growing, but at rather a moderate pace. So therefore, there is a high level of anxiety among the middle-income class, where they spend a huge amount, normally over 40%, on the household spending, particularly on the childhood education and also on Medicare. So this is also a very say perplexing situation. And the other is that given the Chinese gray class, which means that those who are over 60 years old, they already take 16% of the entire population. And these people are not completely covered with their Medicare, with their retirement pension. So there's also a high caution. And also that when the Chinese pension fund is spreading, but it doesn't really produce a lot of revenue so far. So therefore, there's people are still very cautious on the overall spending. So rather now, the much more of the spending is on food, on recreation. It's not really on the big ticket items.
Robert, what do you think of the domestic spending?
Well, it's definitely the key for China going forward in its economic evolution. The big story with the GDP growth going forward is going to be that it's not export driven, but more driven by internal markets, particularly spending from the consumer sector and on things like services and other value-added products like technology. So it is definitely key to China's economic future.
Then what do you think of the income redistribution? Do you think social justice, fair play has become a major concern for the middle class?
Well, certainly. I mean, if you look at it along the lines of what Professor Liu was talking about there, you have this disparity regionally. So you look at a place like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, indeed even Hong Kong, which is part of, as we all know, China now. These areas extremely well, and they have modern lifestyles. You go into the inland areas, and they don't have that. So for people to access those services, those consumer available products and activities, you really see that more in the bigger cities. Now it is moving into second and third tier locations, but there is a bit of a gap there. And so in terms of your question about social justice and how that's going to be achieved, I guess the best hope is that a lot of these developed cities will start to spill over into these second and third tier regions.
You also notice there is also a big gap between different tiers of the population. Actually, I made a calculation over the last quarter. Despite of the complaint over the rising cost of the Chinese blue workers' labor cost, as a matter of fact, that's only add up to $600 US per month. So whereas in Beijing, actually the per capita income is exceeding over 10,000 US dollars. So you know, we are really surrounded by those still very poor people who live in the basement and who earn far less than the general average.
The issue of unemployment, or the other way around, should be an important hallmark for what Premier Li Keqiang calls social stability. Mm-hmm. He says 稳中向好, and the 稳 means stability, and the major hallmark is, of course, the increase in employment. What do you think of the driving force behind tackling effectively and efficiently the issue of unemployment?
Well, I think unemployment in China is actually doing fairly well. If I remember correctly, it's about 4.5%. So I think it's it's not a huge problem at this point, but perceptions matter probably more than the actual numbers. And here I think that, as Rob mentioned, that that there's people in the second, third tier cities that might feel a bit disenfranchised and feel they might not have the same opportunities, and that's crucial, I think, from an employment perspective. So what is the foundation for stability in any society, is hope for a better tomorrow, whether that's from an economic perspective or from a political perspective. So I think as long as people, even if they're living in a basement in Beijing, these Beipiao, right, these migrant workers, people that come here, work very hard, as long as they see a better future for themselves, rising salaries, the ability, if not necessarily to buy a home in Beijing, but back in their hometown, to provide an education, a better future for their children. I think that is an important part of the government's job, and it's focusing on that as well, in that managing not just the economics, the machinery of the economy, but also the perceptions of the economy.
But I would rather challenge this perspective because, number one, statistically, we only have 31 cities that are included in those statistics. Number two is that only the urban population are really included in the unemployment rate calculation. Number three, those who only report unemployment are included, given the Chinese family culture and a lot of 宅男宅女, and they stay at home, they eat on their parents, they do not report on unemployment issue. So a large population are really not really covered by the statistics. So that's why we remain always, around 4%, generally below 4%, or 4.5 is the ceiling that China can really experience. So therefore, I really challenge the reliability and also the comprehensiveness of such a sort of statistical data.
But on the other hand, though, there's also the shadow economy where people work and get paid under the table as well. So I think that is economic activity and sources of income, so that would understate the actual employment.
But by now the big data, but the cloud computing, there's higher difficulty to hide the shadow economy anymore.
Yeah,
but Robert, are you convinced by the official figures? I mean, what do you think of the issue of alleged inaccuracy of the official statistics? Because some government officials in northern provinces of China, for example, were able to cook the sheets, and that indeed has embarrassed the central authorities.
Yeah, that's been going on quite a while, and Bao Cheng and Andy there brought up very good points. I mean, you have on the one hand officially unrecognized, shall we say, figures like Bao Cheng was talking about, and then like Andy was talking about, you have this shadow economy that isn't covered. So on top of that, what you're talking about there, Yang Rui, is that you have these local officials who find it in their best interest for their careers to report glowing figures, and that's always been a factor to keep in mind when you look at local statistics. In fact, at the Economist Intelligence Unit, what we do is we tend to rely on the national statistics, but for local statistics we recalculate using our own methodologies, just because we assume there's going to be some fiddling with the numbers. This is definitely another one of these issues going forward that China should look at more. If it wants to have reliable assessments of its economic prospects, plus when you look at things like trying to sell local government bonds and you want to attract foreign investors, in addition to the issue with ratings agencies, you're going to have reliable economic data that people can trust, just so it can open up efficient markets to alleviate its capital needs.
Well, my understanding,
point,
just real quick,
sorry.
I was just going to say, but my understanding is that there are both biases that overstate economic figures as well as biases that understate, because I think, as Rob was saying, officials get promoted on GDP, job creation, so there's a bias to make those numbers look better. But on the other hand, the tax base, people want to avoid taxes and so therefore underreport economic activity. So I think there are biases going both ways.
Yeah, another pessimism I really can share is that I know that Andy is heavily involved in entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship is not really reliable employment data, because many people, they just burn their pocket money and burn their parents' money, and currently they have a job, they register a company, they can be a CEO of the company, but they're not really earning money. So many of them would end up in looking for a job. So far it is really a pretense of employment.
When we come back, we'll take a look at China's proactive fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy. Stay with us. Coming up next is the issue of liquidity. Do you think SMEs are able to enjoy equal access to funding? And what do you think of the financing costs for them?
Well, I'm personally reasonably optimistic about the availability of financing for SMEs, particularly I would say more in the startup space. And the reason is that there's just so much money chasing good deals, good entrepreneurs. And I think the market largely is efficient. But if we look at more traditional businesses, SMEs, I think that availability of debt financing, is my understanding, can be still quite a challenge because most of that credit is reserved and allocated to state-owned enterprises, and there's definite room for improvement for debt financing in China for SMEs.
Do you think SMEs are struggling with the issue of having enough and sufficient funding for their investment and the startup companies, so on and so forth?
Of course, it is also fair enough that they are denied of the conventional channel of the financing because they do not have a very transparent structure so far, and they do not show a very strong prospect. They do not have the right type of team, and most importantly, they do not have enough assets to really serve as a mortgage whatsoever. So they are not really very much favored by the traditional banking system. But as Andy said, there is plenty of money running around, be it angel investment, be it venture capitalists. So they are there, but they have to go through the test whether they really have the right sexy programs that they can really possibly roll out. So the people always complain about the unequal treatment between SOEs and SMEs. So SOEs, yes, they are there to blackmail the banks because they owe them already a lot. And if you do not finance me the debt, and then you will show red on your book, and then you will be penalized administratively, at least, if not criminally. So therefore, they become a boss of those banks. So the situation has not really improved, and the same thing is for the local governments. Right now they found a new disguise to have access to money because now they have the PPP. So they set up a company, but actually controlled by the government as a city construction company or municipal construction company, but they are still the government leverage, and then they are there to leverage even bigger funds. So that really continually to deepen the debt hole of the local government.
Let me go back to Robert Kapp for his comments on a controversial allegation by Professor Li Daokui of Tsinghua University. He said we should not take the recent rating by Moody very seriously. He said those who work for the rating agency turn out to be just some young university graduates, and they don't have a complete picture about the Chinese economic realities. What do you think of the discussions about the rating agency and the accuracy about the Chinese economic prospects?
Well, I can't comment specifically on the assessment there of Moody's, just because I don't really know how they are operating inside in terms of their hiring practices. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the rating agencies are using a more tested methodology in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. They took on a lot of criticism for not predicting a lot of the problems that then were very manifest once the crisis unfolded. So perhaps the professor is correct in indicating that there's a bit of extra caution in their assessments, but I don't think it'd be quite right to say they're flawed assessments. There is some real issue with China's debt. How great it is and how much that will affect long-term economic growth has yet to be seen, but I think raising the warning flags is prudent.
Well, I think another way to look at it, though, Rob, is that if we look at the history of China's economic development since '78, Western observers using Western traditional metrics have said this can't work. If you don't have a capitalistic, pluralistic system, you cannot have sustained economic growth without the country or the economy imploding. And I wonder if the case with Moody's as well is that they're using more of a conventional, traditional set of metrics based on Western economies, Western practices, and that perhaps they might be missing some intangible factors or other quantitative factors that are specific to China that would reduce the risk, the real risk, so that the downgrade might not be entirely justified.
The issue of economic vibrancy again reminds me of what Premier Li Keqiang said concerning massive entrepreneurship and the spirit of innovation. In fact, in the past 3 years, the number of market entities in China increased by a daily average of 40,000. But most of them, I would say 80% of the young companies set up by university students failed. They went bankrupt. It's a lot of bubbles. So what do you think of the spirit of innovation? Because we are looking at the resilience and vibrancy of the economy itself.
Well, the way I would see it is that it's a kind of literacy. So just like Bill Gates and Will.i.am talked about that children, young adults today need to learn how to code. That's the literacy of the modern age.
Your take?
Well, I do not really be misguided by this figure because one young man today, they can hold 20 of such sort of entities and they may not really go bankruptcy, but they're dysfunctional, they're sleeping over there. And because the local government do not want you to really cancel those companies because they can also fool Premier Li Keqiang with those data. And so that's one thing. The other is considered to be additional tuition that the guys need to pay. So most of those entrepreneurs live on 3 Fs: fools, friends, and families. So until they are really able to tap into those savvy investors, they can be considered to be on the track. Otherwise, it's just a trial. It's a learning curve.
Let's take a quick look at the case study here, Robert. While the innovative and the once budding Chinese economy, Leeco is now struggling with a cash crunch and unpaid debt. Do you think Leeco's case may reflect the ill development of China's emerging entrepreneurship, or of what is it indicative in this area?
Well, I wouldn't want to take it as an indictment of entrepreneurship in China. I think that's going to be very resilient over time, actually. But indeed, relating that point that you just made about Jia Yueting and Leeco, the founder of Leeco there, and what he's found himself in with this huge cash crunch. It's been going on for a number of years, but now the company is seriously saddled with debt. I think it does indicate something to like the points Andy was making. I think there are valid points there to say that the Chinese model is a bit different, but there's still economic reality. Too much debt, too little revenue, that's not good. That's what Leeco has been suffering from.
And I think the other thing was just overly ambitious. I mean, trying to do electric cars, TV, sports. The most critical resource for any company, especially a startup or even a publicly listed company that's growing very quickly, is management attention. And just like a country, you can't fight 3 wars at the same time. That I think Leeco lost its way in the trying to bite off a little bit too much all at once.
Let's look at the real estate market. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, real estate investment grew 8.8% in the first 5 months of 2017. The pace has overtaken the 6.9% GDP growth in the first quarter. That's not a big deal, some of the economists told me. They said the growth rate of the property market should have been 2 to 3 times the GDP growth rate. That would be very normal. What do you think?
Well, I mean, everyone's concerned about real estate in China for different reasons. Consumers from an affordability perspective, investors because it shows an imbalanced economy. I think personally that, lower growth rate is not a bad thing. I agree that it's lower than it has been historically. I'm not sure how relevant the reference is between GDP growth rate and real estate growth rate, personally.
Contribution is 34%, so from real estate to GDP growth rate. But the issue is that it's a structural problem because in Beijing it's skyrocketing all the time. Anytime you bet on a house, you'll turn out to be a winner tomorrow. But in the third-tier cities, in remote areas, it is very difficult. Right now, it is still a large amount of anxiety flowing around now we have the Xin'an new district and people just gather their money and are ready to place a bet, but right now they do not know. So much of all the from the investment point and also from the end delivery, it's all government policy driven, and much is still less transparent.
Well, before we wrap up this very interesting discussion about the Chinese economy, I'd like to have a short answer from each of you three guys about the economic outlook. Very quickly, Robert, what do you think of the sustainability of our economic performance? In the, what do you think?
Well, for the second half of this year, we see it as pretty much on track with the government target, in fact, beating it. So above 6.5% for this year, but we do see it going down next year. I would add, though, that although we see a deceleration, we still think it will be healthy growth for China overall. It won't be a big drop through the floor, in other words.
Belton, what do you think of the sustainability or uncertainty to some degree?
Well, just follow the statistical data of the Chinese government and you'll feel happier.
What do you think of the haunting specter of the so-called systematic financial risks? Are we going to have a hard landing?
Well, I think if we look historically, there's always been a lot of fear about the Chinese economy. But just as Mark Twain said, that they've predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, right? So I think that generally people have been overly pessimistic about the Chinese economy. I think the systemic financial risk is real. Hopefully we see things like the Hong Kong-China Bond Connect, other financial reforms that will bring more transparency, more discipline to the financial sector in China, particularly in the debt sector, I think from a municipal debt as well as corporate debt. But to me, I'm guardedly optimistic about the Chinese economy for a couple reasons. First, look at Tencent revenue growth rate, look at Alibaba revenue growth rate, well into double digits. Look at retail sales growing well above GDP. So I think these are signals that the economy is rebalancing towards being consumer-driven and innovation-driven. So overall, I think the government knows how to fly this airplane. The numbers, I think, make sense, and unless something dramatic happens, I think things will turn out okay.
Bolton, what do you think of the uncertainty and challenges?
Well, uncertainty is that we bet too much on the cutting-edge technology, but whether China is ready only to bet on those technological frontiers. So that's one. The other is really whether human capital is really necessary for a big transformation from a more efficiency-driven into a really productivity-driven economy or innovation-driven economy. And third is really whether China will be able to continue on the reform process to open wider the market and also continue to deregulate and decentralize a number of issues. We can really unleash a better competitiveness and also better productivity.
But I'm afraid many of our viewers would be driven mad by your pessimistic prediction about the advent of the AI age. Namely, the spirit of innovation would be questioned if most of the labor force would be replaced by robots. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.